3D animation is without a doubt one of the most taxing tasks you can put a computer through. Geometry can be dense, shadows, reflections, special effects, they can all easily bring even the fastest machine to its knees in no time flat. And when a machine slows down, you slow down, and nobody ever likes that. So when you're working in Max, it's vital that you think smart and do whatever you can to lighten the load whenever possible. You gotta always keep in mind that no matter how big and bad your computer is, there's only so much processing speed and RAM to go around. And believe me, you'll know when you start running low on resources. The screens redraw slower, the renders take longer, even saving and opening files will feel sluggish. Bottom line, everything you do becomes harder to accomplish. It'd be kind of like pedaling a bike up a hill with a 300-pound football linebacker sitting on your shoulders. You kick that guy off and think how much easier it's going to be to get to the top of the grade. Well, Max works pretty much the same way. The more you put on its back, the more you push down its throat, the tougher and slower the process becomes. So the $64,000 question is, are there things I can do to lighten the load? Absolutely, and you need to think in those terms as much and as often as possible. Let's talk about some of the stuff you can do. Each of these little lines that you see on the teapot is referred to as a segment. And those segments control not just how blocky or smooth the object looks, more segments making the object appear smoother, but they also control just how hard the computer has to work in order to make its computations. So the more lines, the heavier the workload. Now some projects require that your objects have not just hundreds but thousands of those little white lines. A creature that'd be seen up close in a feature film would be a perfect example. A high segment count would ensure that the monster's skin or surface would not just look smooth, but also deform in a realistic way. You'll find other applications, like maybe creating a real-time video game, where the line count has to be kept to a minimum to keep the gameplay from appearing choppy. A high model segment count in a situation like that would prove to be disastrous. What this all means is, you gotta realize that different applications will have different requirements. Even with that though, it's going to be important that you always try to think and build as light as possible, adding details and precision where needed, but always trying to do so with the least amount of overhead in order for both you and the computer to work as efficiently as possible. And as it pertains to working in your views, you can optimize your efforts and system resources by not having all your windows always displaying in what is referred to as shaded mode. What you see on the screen is how Max displays objects in your scene when using the settings as they're set coming out of the factory. Notice how Max displays only a single view in shaded display, while the other three are being shown in what is referred to as wireframe mode. Why do you think Max by default sets things up this way? Well, that's easy. There's less to calculate, less to slow things down. You gotta believe you're pushing your video card harder when you ask for a pretty more detailed picture in each view, right? Now, with a simple scene like this, it's not a big deal. But you start building a bunch of stuff in addition to throwing a special this or that in, and I promise you're going to start seeing things slow down, and sometimes in a big-time way. So if you can control that stuff, and you can, you got to think ahead, you got to work efficiently, you got to build smart, and you got to try to cut down or back wherever you can. It's just a good habit to get yourself in. You'll keep Max happy, and you'll be able to buzz through your workflow quicker. Now, there's a couple other things that'll slow your workflow that you can control when building your scenes. One, when lighting your scene, use shadow casting lights where needed, but don't go crazy. Every light in your scene doesn't need to be throwing down a shadow. Secondly, adding a bumpy or reflective surface to an object will slow things down. Sometimes you can't get around those rough textures and accurate reflections. But at other times, especially when things are a little farther away from the camera, you gotta ask yourself whether you can even see the added surface elements. If you can't, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to add them in, right? And one of the biggest slowdowns you'll experience in your production pipeline is adding special effects, things like explosions and fire and smoke. Again, I'm not saying don't use them, but as you get more experience, you'll learn that sometimes those effects can be created with pictures and not necessarily geometry. You might want to take a look at some of the more advanced titles on lynda.com for more on that. So there's a few things you can keep in mind as you mull over some of the stuff you can do to help Max help you as you work on your projects. Sometimes those reductions can't be made. You just got to swallow hard and take your lumps, expecting there to be slowdowns. But most of the time, there's going to be at least a few things you can do that'll optimize your speed and efficiency. Things you should definitely think about and plan on doing whenever possible.